The lecture hall smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed above a sea of faces. Cynthia Santos balanced a stack of graded essays against her hip and shook her head at the murmurs that had started like a distant thunder. Students whispering, phones up, cameras angled the way they always angled toward spectacle. She had no idea what had stirred them until a single, heavy clap cut the room in two. He walked in like a reckoning. Theo Newman moved through the doorway as if the room had cleared to make way for him. He wore the kind of suit that seemed to absorb light, tailored down to an edge. The silver of his cufflinks caught and flashed like a promise of danger. The nickname had followed him through headlines and back-alley threats, the Reaper of Silvercliffe. The university's press had a softer name for him, an heir, a philanthropist. But anyone who had seen him in business or in vengeance knew the darker truth. He did not need a microphone. His voice filled the hall, flat and precise. "Cynthia Santos," he said. The name dropped into the air and the crowd turned like a school of fish. She straightened. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what he could do. She also knew, with a clarity that surprised her own pulse, that refusing him would make everything worse. But she had spent 23 years refusing the easier, shame-based path of accommodation. She had come from a family where dignity was a currency you guarded with stubbornness. Her father's hands had been rough from decades of running a small construction shop. Her mother's laughter had been the only thing that softened them. Cynthia could feel their faces in the crowd as clearly as the stairs. Theo's hand did not tremble when he reached out and placed a small white box on the professor's desk at the front of the room. A wedding gift, the campus cameras would later call it, an absurd public announcement. But the gesture carried the weight of a chain. He set it down with the casual cruelty of a man who had never had to ask for what he wanted. "I've decided," he said, and the room shrank. "You're my future wife." Laughter bubbled, incredulous and brittle. Students craned for a better look. A few clapped, unsure whether to applaud the audacity or mock the spectacle. A phone flashed in a sea of faces like a lighthouse. Cynthia laughed once, the sound sharp. "You don't even know me," she said. "For how little that matters." He smiled as if tasting irony. "You know enough." Before she could decide what to do next, a new voice cut through the static. Mateo's voice, rough, raw, the kind of voice that still carried the asphalt of the streets he'd come from. He surged from the back, hair wild, eyes rimmed with red. His hand went to her elbow, possessive and desperate. Mateo's presence should have been a comfort. Instead, it only set the Reaper's blade to a new rhythm. "They're calling my dead," Mateo hissed, unable to keep the panic out. "They said if I don't pay..." Theo's gaze fixed on the other man like a long winter. "You made a decision," he said, and the simplicity of it made everything worse. "You can't do this in public," Cynthia said, and the steadiness in her voice held nothing like the plea it sounded. She had been through humiliations before, family dinners that had ended in barbed remarks, professors who dismissed her questions. But a public announcement set the world on a pivot. It made her a spectacle, a thing to be weighed. Theo didn't bother with formalities. He moved the white box toward her and opened it as if consummating an old rite. Inside nestled a pair of cuffed silver bands, one heavy, one delicate, glinting like moons in a dark tide. He held them out with the same tenderness one might use to offer a blade. "Do you accept?" he asked. Her mouth tasted of metal. She heard Mateo swear under her breath. Students held their breath collectively, the moment stretching until it hurt. No one moved. The cameras didn't blink. She did not accept. "You're insane," she said, the words even. "I will not." He cut her off with a movement that was almost gentle. "You will." The University of Silvercliffe would replay that day a dozen times in commentary, each replay polishing his image into legend and tarnishing hers into scandal. They would call it a kidnapping later, when the right papers had been paid and narratives tightened. For now, it was a theater moment, a man with the power to make the world rearrange itself, lifting a silver band and pronouncing an ownership that felt like a noose. Security arrived, men in tidy suits, faces blank. They did not ask questions. They made notes. Asher, Theo's right hand, moved like a shadow at the edge of the crowd. His jaw was a hard line. He did not bother pretending to care about protocol. He stepped forward quietly and took Mateo by the arm with the kind of force that left no doubt who had the option to be brutal and who did not. Mateo's fingers dug into Cynthia's wrist for a second, a raw plea. "Run," he mouthed. She saw the fear in his eyes, more pride open than the rest. He had been careless enough to get in debt, and too loyal to himself to think beyond the next reckless move. She had loved him like one loves a storm, wholehearted and certain that the chaos itself was part of the charm, but storms leave things ruined. Theo's words sailed across the room and struck like a bell. You will appear before me tomorrow, at my father's estate. If you refuse, Matteo will answer for his debts in a way both of you will understand. There was a cruel economy in his threat, one debt for another, an exchange of fates. The camera zoomed. Someone laughed, a sound that was all nervousness. A professor tried to restore decorum, but the moment was already a rupture. Cynthia's students looked at her the way people look at a wound, with curiosity and a flicker of morality that rarely extends help. They released Matteo before the doors closed. He stumbled into the hallway, his breath a broken thing, and the last thing she saw before the hall swallowed him was the sudden, fierce light of a man who had thought himself untouchable and had been shown otherwise. That night, on the walk home, the city felt different, edges sharper, the air thinner. Cynthia tried to tell herself she would not go. She told herself she would fight. She told herself all the things you tell yourself when the world narrows to a single ugly option. She slept badly. Dreams were short and red. A river she could not cross. A dress she could not put on. The next day, she found herself at the gates of a house she had only seen photographed in society columns. Marble steps rose like accusation. Silver gates opened as if they had been expecting her heartbeat. The Newman crest, 2 scythes crossed over a river, sat above the entry, cold, emblematic. She thought of the river in her dreams and wanted to laugh at the coincidence, but the laugh stuck in her throat. Inside, the house was everything headlines promised, and the air exhaled the kind of money that made compassion into a performance. Portraits of Newman ancestors lined the walls. A butler with a face like a mask offered tea with the politeness of someone trained to soothe terror. Scarlet May, Theo's godmother, arrived on cue, an orchestra of social grace behind her. She moved as if the world were a stage, and everyone else was only ever a prop. "Welcome, Cynthia," she said, in a voice that could varnish wood. Scarlet May's smile was the practiced kind that did not reach her eyes. "We prefer elegance in our tragedies." Cynthia did not answer. Words slid from her like mercury, too quick, impossible to clutch. She had brought no luggage. The white box from the lecture hall lay open on Theo's desk. The bands inside winked like warning lights. She kept wanting to touch the cold metal, and then pulling back, as if it might burn. Theo watched her from the doorway, hands in his pockets. Up close, he was less a legend and more a tightly coiled thing, muscles under silk, a shadow behind the veneer. He could be polite when he wanted to be. He chose not to now. "I will make this bearable," he said once, when they were alone. The statement had the ring of an edict. It was not a promise of affection. It was an offer of terms. She wanted to ask what made a life bearable under someone who had announced ownership. She wanted to ask why he had done it at the lecture hall. Why in a place of learning had he transformed her into a lesson? She wanted to say that no silver band could turn her into less than she was. Instead, she asked, "Why me?" Theo's eyes were unreadable. "Because you were available," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said. "Because you make them talk." He did not say, "I chose you because I couldn't forget you on the river." He did not say the thing his heart sometimes betrayed him into thinking. "I chose you because every time I closed my eyes, I saw you, limbed in moonlight, stubborn as a knot." He kept the poem of himself locked inside his ribs. Days in the Newman house took on a rhythm that was meticulously arranged to tire her into submission. She had a room that had once been used as a bridal suite. A wedding dress hung in an armoire like a ghost, its satin fold sedate, its lace crisp. The sight of it made her pulse like a trapped animal. At night, she would lie on the bed and imagine unpicking the seams of the life they tried to stitch onto her. There were rules. Asher's name anchored them. He taught her the measured language of obedience with eyes that didn't blink. He would appear anywhere Theo's power felt like a threat and remind her with small acts of force that there was always someone watching. Yet, threaded between the threats, there were moments that confused her into weakness. A bowl of soup, heavy with roasted carrots and thyme, set in front of her when she had fallen ill with a fever, left by an unseen hand on her door. A set of pajamas, mercifully plain, placed on the chair as if someone had read her mind and decided she deserved comfort. Once, in the silver-walled kitchen, she found Theo at the stove, sleeves rolled, hands deft with a knife. He had a bandage on his knuckle and was humming a song that had the memory of the river in it. Cynthia watched him consider sausages like a man assessing a boardroom. There was no audience. There was no scythe. He looked for a moment like someone who could be domestic, human. He glanced up and met her eyes, and in that split second, something almost like apology unfastened and then snapped back into place. "You could leave," she said one evening, when the house was a map of shadows and the lamps were low. The sentence was an offering, an open door. "Where would you go?" he asked. It was not a question tossed lightly. It was a question of geography and of power. She thought of her parents' small house, of the way her mother's hands trembled when she spoke of saving face. She thought of the river and the way the city belonged to men who traded in fear. "I don't know," she admitted. He did not push. Instead, he climbed onto the windowsill and stared out at the cold city where his influence reached like fingers. The crest of Silvercliffe was in the distance, steel and glass and the places where law and money met in secret and shook hands. There were times she watched him with a kind of awful curiosity, and worse, a recognition that her fear sometimes loosened into something else. Curiosity about the man who could change the courses of lives. He could have been a savior. He could have been a tyrant. He preferred to be both. Mateo showed up one evening with a bruise fresh along his jaw and his charm stripped because fear had taken away the part of him that made jokes about the weather.
He tried to take her away that night, the way men who loved recklessly attempt salvage. He told the tale like it was a rescue, told the version where he wrestled past guards and emerged triumphant. Cynthia saw only the edge of his plan in the way his palms shook. They had a fight in the shadows of the garden. Mateo's voice rose. A neighbor might have thought they were arguing about money. Theo watched from the gilded windows with an expression Cynthia could not name. When it ended, Mateo left swearing and a little broken, and the house shut its teeth like a trap. Weeks passed, and the outside world began to form its own narrative. Photos leaked, Cynthia in a gown, Cynthia in pearls, Cynthia looking small and composed. Twitter lights flared with hashtags, op-eds took sides. People argued whether the Newmans were cruel or merely efficient. Some said she would come to love the life she had been forced into, because power softened everything. Others suspected the opposite, that the house would swallow her like a tide. Inside, the life was less public and more intimate in ways that hurt. Theo liked the blinds open in the mornings, so the silver light would strip the day down to its raw components. He would leave money on her dressing table with notes. Pay your tuition, see your parents, get the papers you need. Each note was an assertion of control disguised as care. He was jealous in the softest ways. He forbade certain phone numbers from being dialed. He made arrangements with her parents that were generous enough to silence them, and he offered a small brand of safety that had been missing from their working-class lives. Cynthia knew he did this because he could, not because he felt penitent. But convenience can be a cloak for tenderness, or tenderness a veil for convenience. Sometimes the edges blurred until she couldn't tell which she was receiving. One night, she found a package wrapped in baby blue tissue in the top drawer of her bureau. She did not open it at first. It sat like a question, the edges of its paper soft under her fingers. There was a note tucked inside, in Theo's precise hand. "I did not think you would like it, so I left it here to frighten you. Do not be surprised if you end up needing it." The choice of words made her laugh, then stop. She did not want children with Theo. She wanted to be allowed to say no. She wanted to be allowed to plan a life that didn't involve being someone's trophy. But the package squatted in the drawer like a future she hadn't agreed to. Her body began to send messages in small, traitorous ways. In the middle of a lecture, she felt a wave of nausea that had no rational explanation. At night, she awoke with a tightness under her ribs, a tenderness that made the world seem like it might tilt. She visited the clinic under the cover of a neutral reason, an appointment to sign paperwork. The doctor was efficient and kind, and after she stepped behind the curtain in a room smelling of antiseptic and lemon, she handed her a small, sterile stick and said nothing. The strip was bulky and clinical, as if it had been stamped by bureaucracy. She closed the curtain and trembled, her hands too small to feel like they belonged in that room. The test sat between the hem of a paper gown and the edge of the world, and when the results showed a line and then another, it felt like a door closing, with a sound that was at once final and impossible. Pregnant. The word reverberated. It was not terrible. It was not miraculous. It simply existed, heavy and undeniable. A life nested under her ribs that had no stake in the politics of debts or the aims of men. Its existence reframed everything. A future would have to be negotiated on behalf of a tiny person whose presence would complicate power in a way no one suspected. She left the clinic with her phone clutched like a talisman. The city seemed to step back, as if making room for a secret. A man in a black coat watched her cross the street, and then melted into the crowd like a stain. When she reached the house, the silver band on Theo's desk flashed in the evening light, like a lighthouse for gulls. Theo met her at the door with a linen handkerchief and the practiced cool of a man who could hide his reactions beneath a mask. "Everything all right?" he asked. She could have lied. She could have crafted a sentence around the idea that she would always have the final say about her body, that no one could own another's womb. She could have demanded autonomy like a weapon. Instead, she watched his pupils contract, the little, almost ghost of a man who could never quite allow himself to feel. For a second, she thought she saw his arm tremble. He was not one for displays, which means this moment, this tiny, slight softening, was important. "Yes," she said, truth folded in an exhale. "We need to talk." They did not speak in the kitchen. They did not need to. That night, when the house had quieted and the only sounds were the slow tick of a clock and the faint whisper of the river outside the city, a river that had pulled her into a life she could not remember, she stood by the window and wondered what kind of life could be built inside these walls for a child who had done nothing but exist. Theo watched her with a focus so fierce it was almost possessive. He moved as if rehearsing mid-century gentility and modern force at once. When he finally spoke, his voice had the soft threat of someone promising absolution without asking for forgiveness. "This changes things," he said. "Yes," she answered. "It does." He could have arranged for an abortion with a call. He could have offered to erase the pregnancy with the kind of private efficacy his family employed when they wanted to tidy inconvenient things. That he did not speak the word, did not offer the erasure, was something like mercy or like calculation. Cynthia could not decide which she feared more. Outside, a car idled at the curb. Mateo drove by slowly, as if measuring the house's perimeter with his heartbeat. Ivy's name had surfaced in whispers, an ally to some who wished to see the Newmans wrenched through scandal. Scarlet May had made her rounds at dinner parties, offering brittle smiles and a plate lifted like a gauntlet. The house felt the tug of other forces, rival families waiting with knives behind velvet gloves, political players wanting leverage, debts that breathed like monsters under pillows. That night, when she went to the room with the wedding dress, she opened the closet and pulled the garment out. It hung like accusation. The satin kissed her palms. She imagined folding it into a box and throwing it into the river, letting the current take the lie and the shimmer and the silver away. Instead, she laid it on the bed and touched the lace, and a memory surfaced. Water, cold and fast, a strong pair of hands under her arms pulling her free, the smell of wood smoke and the taste of pennies against her tongue. She could not remember the face clearly. Men blur when fear sits across your eyes. But in the corners of her mind, a silhouette wore a coat that looked much like the way Theo wore a silence. She tried to chase the memory down, but each time she reached it, it slipped like oil through fingers. The pregnancy gave her a kind of clarity. If she could think of the child as separate, a person worthy of its own rights and future, then she owed it to that child to make decisions that would protect freedom, not trade it for safety. The problem was that safety here came wrapped in silver and guarded by men who could make laws bend like reeds. She started making small plans, practical things like whose name to file, how to get documents, whether to tell her parents. Each time she thought of telling them, she saw their faces tightening, the way their mouths folded around worry as if it were a habit. She could hear her mother's voice, practical and frightened, asking what would people say. She wanted to drown out that voice with something stronger, a sound that could both soothe and command. The house held its breath for her decision. Theo shifted like a man on the edge of a cliff, one thought away from either confession or calamity. He called Asher in and gave him orders that surprised her for their tenderness. "Make sure she had privacy at the doctor," he said. "Do not let anyone touch her." Asher walked out like the heavier part of mercy. His face is still a stone. It did not make anything less dangerous. It simply rearranged the agents of threat. There was a night they sat in the sitting room with a record playing softly, and the house reduced to an intimacy that felt dangerous. Theo spoke of contracts and succession, of vows and the way the family had always made alliances. He used words like legacy and lineage as if they were virtues. Cynthia watched him, thinking of a child who would grow up with the shadow of the Newman crest over their cradle. Theo's hands were on his knees, folded tight. "I won't let them take you," he said suddenly. The sentence landed with the honesty of someone unpracticed in confession. He did not say it with a plea.
He said it like an accusation leveled at anyone who might consider harming her. "You think they want to take me?" she asked. The question was softer than she felt. Her own heart thudded like a drum in the quiet. "People take what they can." He did not elaborate. The house seemed to smell of silver and rain. She left him there to his thoughts and went to the room with the window that looked out over the river. The water flowed indifferent and merciless. The sky pressed low. She imagined a future where the child could run free past construction lots and river walks, where names were not weighted with threats. It was a small dream, but it belonged to her alone. In the days that followed, the household tightened. Theo's family arranged for more security, for doctors who would make this pregnancy their business and not hers. Men in crisp coats loitered in the threshold of rooms. Scarlet May offered to throw a luncheon under the pretense of hospitality, but hinted, through sugary words, that becoming a Newman would open doors the universe otherwise kept shut. Ivy sent a message, brief, sly, that she had allies who could be inconvenient. Mateo's voice grew ragged in the evenings. He started showing up with other men, desperate. Sometimes he would speak in the hallways late at night, and Cynthia would catch stray bits. Threats muttered, payment plans, names of places she had never heard of. She was not exempt from humiliation. Theo took her to events and set her on display like an exotic piece some patrons admired cautiously. They asked derisive questions about her education and her bloodline. She fielded them with equanimity that was fast turning into armor. He enjoyed, in his way, seeing her deflect and answer and retain dignity. It amused him that she would not fold. And then, in a quiet corner of the house one morning, a knock at the door came with the force of an announcement. Theo opened the door, and in the doorway stood Mateo, his knuckles gone white around a small burnt envelope. He did not come to beg. He came to bargain. Cynthia listened as men bartered, Mateo offering to work off debts in ways he had not yet defined, Theo calculating risk like an accountant of people. At the end of it, a line was drawn. Mateo would remain alive so long as he stayed away. The family wanted no more complications. The city wanted no more headlines. The solution pleased no one, but conserved what needed conserving. That night, she dreamed of the river again, and this time the dream ended with the image of a silver band sinking slowly into water and dissolving into an endless current.
She woke with the taste of pennies and the knowledge that her body had already begun to change. She would have to make choices, not only for herself, but for the small life she carried. A life that gave her power she had not anticipated. The power to force decisions from men who had assumed they could take anything. She did not know yet how to use that power. She did not know whether this would make her safer or mark her like prey. But she was no longer simply a woman pushed into a ring. She was a carrier of possibility. That fact, fragile and fierce, held the future like a small flame. On a morning that smelled of rain, Cynthia received a letter slipped under her door. The crest at the top was unfamiliar, a scythe carved through a river, the Newman mark altered, stylized. Inside, in the clean hand of someone who had the wealth to make threats elegant, were two words that slid like ice under her skin. Be careful. She folded the paper and held it to her chest, as if a child might sleep between her ribs. Beyond the house walls, the city hummed with people who thought they owned outcomes. Inside the house, Theo sat at a desk with the white bands from the lecture hall gleaming. He rubbed his thumb over the cool metal, and for the first time, in a way that had nothing to do with ownership or plan, felt the weight of what he had promised. There would be no easy route. Choices were already being made on her behalf by men who thought protection could be bought. Somewhere, Mateo plotted retaliation. Ivy watched and waited. Scarlet May smiled as if this were merely a chessboard. Asher kept his eyes on the doors and on the people who might arrive bearing bad news. Cynthia folded the paper into the drawer and took out the tiny baby item that had been left for her. She held it and let the cotton brush her skin. For the first time since the lecture hall, the future did not feel entirely like a cage. It felt more complicatedly like an inheritance, of danger and of possibility both. Outside, thunder rolled like applause. In the garden, the river kept moving, patient and indifferent.
silvered in the dusk. And in a room where portraits watched like jurors, two people, one who had taken, one who had been taken, adjusted to an existence that would demand everything of them and give so little in return. The house settled around them, a vast organism of power that had not yet decided whether it would preserve them or eat them alive. The next move would be decisive, and neither of them, for all their secrets and ferocity, could yet say what shape that move would take. The only certainty was the slow, impossible fact growing inside Cynthia, a life that neither family had planned for, and that held the dangerous, redemptive promise of change. The house kept its breath for weeks, as if waiting for a verdict.
Security tightened in ways Cynthia could count on the fingers of one hand. New men at the gate, cameras trained like curious eyes, Asher stationed at thresholds with the permanence of stone. Scarlet May smiled at luncheons and laid into gossip like a predator choosing a throat. Ivy slipped notes into corridors and folded threats into glossy envelopes. Mateo haunted the edges of the city like a memory that refused to fade, alternately pleading and promising rage. Everyone circled, weighing probabilities, calculating outcomes. Inside the walls, life moved in increments small enough to seem ordinary. The scrape of a spoon on porcelain, the clink of a mug moved aside when another took it, the faint rustle of the wedding dress when Cynthia opened the armoire and let it breathe for a few minutes. Those tiny domesticities were a fragile currency in a household that taught possession as a language. They were also, impossibly, the place where she began to gather herself. She read, not out of nostalgia for the classroom drama that had made her defiant, but because words gave her maps, contracts, statutes, guardianship clauses, legalities that looked less like theoretic ink and more like locks she might one day pick. She made lists, practical and cold, passports, power of attorney, trusted contacts, a safe place where a child could be taken if the worst happened. Each list was a prayer in a new tongue. Each crossed-off item was a small blade against panic. Theo watched these preparations with a hard interest, as if measuring some private line between his need to protect and a grudging recognition that she would not be shaped wholly by his will. There were moments when his eyes unclenched, and she glimpsed the man who had once stood in the river's margins. Only a sliver of him, half masked by cruelty. He would sit at the foot of her bed sometimes, hands folded on his knees, and speak of things that were not strategy, the names of his ancestors, places he'd once wanted to visit but never had, the smell of cedar in a private cabin he refused to build because privacy had become a commodity he could not afford. "You don't have to bear this alone," he said on one of those nights, voice thick in a way that wasn't his usual flat precision. It was not offered as a command but as an admission, a small fracture in the armor. She bristled, the reflex of someone who had been trained to hold her breath until nothing inside of her moved. "I don't want to be shadowed by men forever," she told him. "I want my child to have a name beyond this crest." He did not answer with a platitude. Instead, he took out the small knitted garment she had tucked away, a cap the color of river water, a soft thing that had arrived anonymously weeks earlier. He had folded it and placed it inside her drawer, as if the sight of it might settle him too. "Then I'll make sure the crest means something else," he murmured. "I'll make sure it cannot be used to take what is yours." There was a pledge in the vow that made Cynthia's chest tightened. Vows in that house carried weight, but they also carried consequences. What he meant, she understood imperfectly, not only protection, but the kind of control that rearranged lives. She wanted him to be different because she saw that private split, his will to command and a sudden willingness to sacrifice. But she also knew sacrifice could be a new form of ownership if it came with no consent. So she watched him with a wary gratitude and continued to stack her lists like armor. The world outside did not wait for the two of them to reconcile. News feeds churned. The lecture hall incident became a study in power plays. The pregnancy became an open secret, whispered in private messages, gossiped over cocktails. Political operatives smelled leverage. Rival families watched with quiet hunger. Scarlet May, who had always treated influence like a carefully folded letter, suggested a charity dinner, a gala that would present the Newmans as a family settling into a new chapter, a portrait of legitimacy. "We will show them the heart of Silvercliffe," she told Cynthia in a way that smoothed her voice with flattery. "It will make your position here more natural. People love a story of unity." Theo agreed on paper, though in private he called it a platform, an opportunity to control a narrative, to swamp rumor with spectacle. He assigned men to route traffic, to vet every canapé,
to ensure every guest had the social credentials that made them less likely to be inconvenient. Cynthia agreed because she wanted the story to be about something other than the fact that she had been forced into a ring, and because she wanted, for the child's sake, to keep options open. The gala shimmered under crystal chandeliers. Silver helm opera glass cufflinks flashed like small moons. Conversations flowed over polished glasses. Guests smiled in that careful, measured way people do when they are aware of cameras and legal teams at the edges of banquets. Scarlet May presided like a conductor, and Theo moved through the room the way a shadow moves through light, present but not always noticed. Cynthia wore the white gown they had selected for her, simpler than the one in the armoire, practical, less a trap and more a neutral frame. She held her posture like a woman accustomed to being observed, and behind her ribs, the small life that had refused to be erased kicked gently, as if agreeing with the rhythm of the room. Near the end of the evening, when platters moved like tide and hands reached for delicate treats, Theo excused himself briefly. He said something about attending to a guest, but his absence lasted only a few minutes. He returned with the steadiness of someone who had solved a minor problem, a smile too practiced. "Everything in order?" Cynthia asked, more to fill the quiet. "Everything," he said. He reached for a glass, and Cynthia saw the way his fingers hesitated, quick as a thought. A tray had been passed by then, a small plate with tiny pastries glazed with pearlescent icing. Ivy laughed at the next table, loud and easy, and the band played on. The first sign that something was wrong was almost academic, a ripple along the base of Cynthia's skull, a change in the light behind her eyes. A sound hit the back of her throat like someone squeezing a bell. Her vision narrowed. It was the sort of narrowing that happens before falling into cold water, the peripheral slipping away, the tunnel closing. People shifted. A guest clapped a hand to his chest as if an asthma attack had come unbidden. A woman beside Cynthia gasped. A waiter spilled a tray. The chandelier light seemed to tilt. Theo's head snapped toward her. For a single immediate second, all the airs and measures fell from him. The Reaper of Silvercliffe, the man whose reputation had been built on a capacity for cruelty, moved with the velocity of a man who had been taught to react to threat his whole life. He shoved chairs away with decisive hands and reached for her. "You will be safe," he said, in a voice that was not necessarily to soothe others so much as to anchor her. "Asher, get her out, now." Asher was there like an answering thought, strong hands lifting Cynthia under the arms and carrying her as if she were a piece of life to be preserved. The crowd blurred into a tide of faces. Panic, phones out, someone shouting, "Call an ambulance!" And the small party devolved into the chaos of people who had not been taught how to prevent harm because they were used only to being protected. Outside, wind tangled with the tail of a limousine. A paramedic team fought through the gate. Theo moved with them, his coat shedding on the marble steps like a banner. Cynthia's thoughts extended and then fractured. She saw a face, half tilted, and recognized a target in the way Ivy's eyes had lingered at the service table. Even folding into the ambulance's confines, the scent of almonds and metal ghosted through the air in her memory, an odd, bitter thing that later would be identified as the lacquer of the poison. At the hospital, they worked with a speed that made the world compress into priorities. Violet light watched the linoleum as the emergency room swallowed them. Monitors clicked and beeped. Nurses spoke in clipped sentences that were a shorthand for professional defiance against something both rare and quick. The diagnosis came as information and as a verdict. A rare alkaloid compound, a slow-acting but potent neurotoxin that interfered with cardiac rhythm and could be fatal within hours without treatment. The poison was designed to mimic a natural compound, but synthetic enough to avoid routine detection. It moved through the body like a rumor, soft at first, then irreversible. The first person who said the word targeted was a young doctor with patient eyes. "Someone intended harm," she announced. "This was deliberate."
It was the sort of sentence that makes a world tilt again. Deliberate. The hospital filled with officials calling family numbers and arranging critical care. Under normal circumstances, IVs and antidotes would appear. But this toxin required something more specific, a monoclonal antibody that could be derived from a rare antigen. There were a few labs in Europe that had the capacity. Treatment would take time and logistics. Time was something Cynthia could feel smoothing into a knife. Theo's reaction was an unfolding of decisions. He stood at Cynthia's side as monitors translated her body into sounds. For the first time in weeks, he seemed like a man operating solely under the force of feeling rather than strategy. He did not retreat behind control. He stayed, like a sentinel who had decided the only proper function of a sentinel was to stay until the end. "We need blood," the doctor said, voice brisk. "A transfusion may help stabilize her while we prepare the antibody therapy. We also want to check family blood markers. If there's a match, it could help us produce a targeted treatment faster." Theo's jaw set. Something quiet and ruthless lit behind his eyes. Not cruelty now, but the same appetite for results that had made him feared. He signed forms with swift, sure strokes. He offered his arm without ceremonial speech. "We do what we can," he muttered. And for a moment, the man who had once used ownership as proof of power looked merely like someone whose entire world compressed into the pulse of another. They took blood. It was a procedural thing, the kind of small violence to the body that hospitals perform daily. Theo watched the tube fill with his blood as if the site were a compass. Nurses moved with choreography. The lab contacted a research facility through a network one could only access with Theo's privileges. Men in suits negotiated rapid transport. Lawyers smoothed signatories. A private jet waited. The city outside the hospital hummed, unaware of the mechanisms a man of power could lever. Privilege used for saving, not merely buying. Cynthia moved in and out of consciousness like someone shifting across thresholds. Long stretches of fog and noise punctuated by clear, sharp images. Theo's hand gripping hers, the color of his cufflinks flashing in surgical light. A phrase he repeated like a litany. "Stay with me." The words were less an order than a plea. It was not the first time he had given orders to the world. It was the first time he seemed to be ordering himself to stay. They stabilized her for the night. The research facility's courier arrived with a vial that smelled faintly of antiseptic and promise. The antibodies were not a cure. They were a specific tool that would bind to the novel compound and neutralize it. It worked in stages. The doctors explained the process with a careful optimism that masked fear. Time, they counseled. More time would mean more certainty. Theo did not sleep.
He hovered as she moved through the hours. At one point, he stepped out into the cold corridor and called Asher. He did not use the soft directives of a base of power. He used a voice that carried worry, like a bone-deep ache. "Find Ivy," he said. "Find Mateo. Bring them to me." Asher's face did not change. He nodded and left. When he returned, the story was corrosive in its simplicity. Mateo had been shopping at a market far from the city with a new companion who had no love for him. He had vanished before Asher's men arrived. Ivy, however, had been arrested at a private residence near the docks with a quantity of the same alkaloid in a cleverly hidden bottle. She clutched a phone and smiled thinly, like someone who had been certain of impunity until the net tightened. "She won't talk," Asher reported. "Not yet." "She will," Theo said quietly. There was an urgency in his voice that was almost parental. "She will, if she knows what she's bargaining for." But the poison had already moved. Cynthia's heart fluttered in arrhythmic suggestions, and antibiotics and antibodies had to wrestle for purchase. Somewhere, the lab technician on the overnight shift watched a graph line climb and breathe a private prayer as it dipped. Hours later, after the crisis had reached a tenuous equilibrium, Theo sat beside Cynthia and waited for her to come fully back. When she finally opened her eyes, they were wet with sleep and fear. "Theo?" she whispered, as if testing it. "Here," he said, and a small smile cracked the usual mask. "You gave us quite the trouble." She chuckled, a short, disbelief-tinged sound. He reached for her hand and pressed the cap he'd brought to the hospital into her palm, the blue knitted thing, still soft. "For the child," he said, and the way he said it carried the weight of promises and costs. "What happened?" she asked. The images lurked, banquet laughter, an odd taste like almonds, the feeling of falling away. "You were poisoned," he said plainly, deliberately. Her face darkened in a public expression of revulsion. "By whom?" He looked at the door, then back at her. "People who thought getting rid of you would solve a problem." Cynthia's reaction was a sharpened thing. Rage, always a close sibling to fear, woke in her. She wanted to move, to arrange the lists into motions, and set the men to work like chess pieces.
But the body that had been invaded needed time, care, and she had to accept both. In the weeks that followed, the household's politics shifted like tectonic plates. Ivy's arrest produced more questions than answers. She kept the mouths of truth shut by bargaining knowledge for survival. Mateo remained a phantom in the city, part memory, part threat. Scarlet May's polished social front began to crack as newspaper columnists, ever hungry for scandal, started to pry at the edges of the Newmans' private deals. The police opened inquiries. A few names surfaced.
Some of Theo's rivals found their funding streams interrupted by newly revealed sanctions and legal pressure. Chaos, the kind Theo had long cultivated, began to edge back toward him. But the poison had done more than put Cynthia in a hospital bed. It had forced something else into daylight, Theo's willingness to cross the final threshold. He began to move not only as protector, but as penitent, as someone who recognized that some weights cannot be lifted by money or fear. One evening, a week after the poisoning, he escorted Cynthia to a small room in the house that she had not noticed before. It smelled faintly of cedar and paper. On a low table lay a stack of envelopes, tied by a ribbon. They were legal documents, orderly and cold, the sort of thing that could only be written by someone who understood the mechanics of power. "I have set up a trust," he said. He did not announce it as a gift, but as a fact to be recorded. "For your child, for you. The Newman Foundation will be restructured. You will have control when the child is of age." Cynthia's throat tightened. Papers were a form of speech in his world, an action that changed the name of the future. She opened an envelope and read of stipulations and legal designations. As she read, the sentences rearranged their lives like a locksmith working quietly. There were clauses that removed the child's title from the family crest, odd stipulations that broke customary succession patterns. There was a paragraph that tied a portion of the family's assets to the care of the child in perpetuity. There were others, sealed and unreadable for now, that hinted at a larger undoing. Why, she asked. Not why he had done it, why he would give away a part of what he came from, why he would unravel lines of power for a woman who had been, by force, bound to him. He sighed. In that sound there was a confession of the wrongness of past deeds. "Because I realized I could do something others couldn't," he said. "Because you and the child are not a line of power, you are a life. I made mistakes. This is one thing I can take responsibility for without making it another sort of ownership." It was not a clean or apologetic absolution. It was something like atonement, an arrangement of future facts that would limit what his name could do to them. For Cynthia, it was complicated relief. For Theo, a legal abdication that might cost him his family's wrath. Not everyone took kindly to the rearrangement. Mr. Newman, the apex of the house, a man whose reputation had been carved into the city's bedrock, saw his son's actions as a needless fracture. Scarlet May, whose loyalty was as much to influence as to blood, whispered about betrayal and the danger of making public concessions. For the first time in his life, Theo had set a course that did not maximize power. It unsettled people who had believed power was the only currency that mattered. "You're making enemies, mister,"
Newman told him in a voice that was flat with disappointment. "Power is a ledger, Theo. You don't give pieces away." Theo's reply was quiet. "I'm making sure they're not used to take what isn't theirs anymore." The tension that followed could be measured in small acts: security placed near the child's prospective nursery, lawyers assigned to seal the trust, Asher watching the entrances like a living lock. Scarlet May, seething, flirted with alliances. Mateo skulked in the shadows like an ember that could spark into flame. Ivy, from a cell, still held cards that could rewrite scenes. The house pulsed with a danger that had not subsided. Cynthia, for her part, began to take more visible action. She approved the trust clauses, met with lawyers, and demanded to be included in every decision about the child's future. She sat in a small office with a young attorney who explained the small, dull algebra of estate law and guardianship. When she left the meeting, she felt a small, private victory, the sense that she was adding her own lines to the ledger rather than having them written for her. 1 month after the gala, when the city had nearly forgotten the sharpness of the poisoning, a new event threatened to reopen the wound. A late-night call woke Cynthia. The voice on the line was panicked, someone claiming to be a friend of Mateo's, calling from a phone with an accent and a tiny crack of desperation. The message was short. Mateo was in trouble. Someone had followed him to an abandoned warehouse near the river. He wanted help.
Cynthia felt the old instinct, a pull toward rescue for someone she had once loved. It was a muscle memory of raw tenderness. She could imagine his brown eyes, the roughness of his voice. But she had lists now. She had lawyers and alarms and a child's future that tilted the scales. She told the voice to give a location and hung up, then called Asher. "We're not sending you in alone," she told him. "Take 3 men. Keep it quiet. If he's been set up, we need to know why." Asher hesitated, as if a man could choose how personally he took a command. He left immediately. They found Mateo in a warehouse bright with flood lamps and the smell of rust. He was bruised and thin, cornered between men who looked like hired muscle in the city. Cynthia and Asher's team barged in like an assertion. Mateo's eyes widened when he saw her, shock and a kind of stunted gratitude. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't gambled," she said, then softened. "Tell me who sent them." He laughed, a brittle sound. "You think it's that simple? I owe money, Cindy, but I'm not an idiot. Someone paid to make me look dangerous again. Someone wants your child gone." The admission hit like a new weight. Mateo had, in his reckless way, become a pawn. But who would move the pieces? Ivy, Scarlet May, a rival family hoping to push the Newmans into the limelight and out of power.
The answers were messy and staggered, like carnival lights. For days afterward, Cynthia could not shake the image of Mateo pressed into the warehouse corner. She found that pity had less and less space in her chest. It was crowded now by new responsibilities and a careful architecting of the child's life. She told herself she would not soften to the point of breaking what she had built. She would not allow nostalgia to be a hole through which danger could re-enter. The legal investigations continued. The police built a case against Ivy and several minor players tied to Mateo. Evidence accumulated: recordings, bank transfers, a pattern of payments. Theo supplied resources quietly: investigators, security sweeps, translation of codes that meant nothing to Cynthia except in the way it marked an enemy. Then came the final move, an escalation that felt as if the world itself had decided to conclude the argument. Scarlet May arranged a small, private event, an unveiling for a charitable hospital wing in Bio's name. It was the kind of thing that painted benevolence on an institution's reputation: speeches, plaques, an audience of donors who preferred their philanthropy clean and photographed. Cynthia agreed to be there because the donors were the same people who would later support legal frameworks. It had the logic of influence and the soft rhetoric of goodwill. The night was crisp and clear. The hospital's new wing glowed like a promise. Families in evening dress drifted among floral arrangements, their laughter the low hum of privileged comfort. Theo made a speech, short, measured, about responsibility and community, and Cynthia watched him, feeling in her chest the complex tangle of gratitude and grief. After the applause, they moved into a smaller room for photographs. An elderly donor approached Cynthia with tearful praise for her courage. Ivy was not on the guest list, but she was there. Seats had a way of being flexible when money and favor bent them. Thorny things have a talent for arriving where they are not invited. At the back of the room, a waiter set down a carafe of a dark, shimmering drink. It looked innocuous, merely an accompaniment to canopies, until someone noticed the same faint scent that had been in the air the night of the banquet. The memory of almonds rose like an acid. For Cynthia, the past inhaled, and she tasted it again. Chaos this time was immediate. A low murmur rippled through the guests and then exploded into shouts. A woman nearby clutched her throat and fell. Theo moved like a man who had practiced responding to threats his whole life. He pushed aside speakers, crossed chairs, and reached into the thinning crowd. "Get her to the car," he barked at a security man, and then he was at Cynthia's side, eyes wide and terrifying in their focus. She felt it begin again, weakness and a cold that reached into her bones. She looked up and saw Ivy's face for the merest moment, a flash of triumph that made her want to scream. But she had no voice that would form into sound. Theo didn't hesitate. He grabbed a carafe, one that looked like one of a set, and he grabbed 2 glasses. He swore something at Asher, and then he brought one glass to his lips. For a microsecond, she thought it was a calculated bluff, an attempt to deceive someone in the crowd. Instead, with a precision that made the world slow, he tipped the liquid back and swallowed. "Don't be ridiculous," someone shouted. "You'll kill yourself." He didn't speak. He merely drank. The glass clinked on the rim of the table. The man who had used ownership and threat to move the world around him had just undone the most important rule he had ever lived by. He exposed himself to the same risk as the one he had sworn to protect. People screamed then, hands grabbed at coats, and security pushed for exits. The scene was a blur of light and sound, and small, sharp accidents. Theo stood at the center of it, face pale already,
but set with an urgency that admitted no compromise. Cynthia's memory of the ambulance that followed was a collage of impressions, a sense of movement, the cold of a stretcher, monitors attached like tense jewelry. The hospital swallowed them again, and this time the room filled with specialists who looked at Theo as if he were no longer a threat, but a human bleeding in the same way as any other. Why? Cynthia asked, when she could find voice between the drugs and pain and the mechanical voice of monitors. He reached for her, not with a hand that wanted to own, but with a touch that wanted to reconcile. Because you matter, he said. Because you and the child matter more than any ledger. He did not say, I love you in some florid declaration of romance. He said it in a series of smaller acts, a completed legal trust, a public admission, a step into a poisoned cup before she had to. But there was a last thing he added, quiet and private and raw. If anything happens, he murmured, eyes half closed. He coughed. I recorded it all, for you, so you will know I never lied about certain things. Not that I've always been right, but He did not finish the sentence. What he had not said was unnecessary. An admission could not unmake the past, but it could be a lamp for the future. The blood work was brutal and immediate. The second poisoning was more than an echo. It was a strike that foresaw a pattern. Doctors worked to identify the compound, a variation on the previous toxin, designed to be more lethal and less countered by specific antibody therapy. Time again was the enemy. The lab technicians looked at the graph and grimaced. A minute's delay to mean life or death. In a quieter room down the hall, Cynthia watched as doctors explained options. They would attempt a new course of antibodies derived from Theo's blood, quickly processed and given. Theo, still conscious, refused sedation. He held Cynthia's hand and watched the machines.
He signed the necessary release forms with a steadiness that made the doctors look at him as if he were a strange kind of saint, someone who gave himself as medicine. If my body helps save you, he whispered, then it's worth it. The machines churned. Nurses moved like those who had practiced ritual under fire. Theo's face, always the mask of control, went slack for a second with exhaustion, then tightened again. He made a small clarification before the transfusions began. Make sure the recordings are given to her regardless, he said. Not the ones that excuse me, the ones that explain why I did what I did. He wanted his truth delivered, a record that wouldn't romanticize the wrongs, but would give Cynthia the facts she needed to live and to protect the child. That too was love in his language, not just a sacrifice of blood, but a deliberate, careful arrangement to shield her from rumor and to confront the Newman sins with the light of confession. Transfusions started. For hours, the hospital was a steady in waiting and lit tubes. Cynthia drifted in and out of sleep. Theo's skin turned waxen. Machines translated his heartbeat into jittering lines. Nurses adjusted dosage. At one point, he squeezed hers with a pressure that suggested he had given everything except his final dignity. Tell me something I remember, he murmured suddenly, in a voice that sounded like it was from far away. Cynthia blinked. The river, she said without thinking. You saved me there once. A smile ghosted his lips, a frail thing. I remember pulling you out, he said. You kicked like an animal, and I thought, stubborn. That's what I liked. Stubbornness. Don't make me laugh, she said, and the sound was a soft, wet thing. Laughter in a hospital corridor is like ringing in a hollow, fragile but real. He used the moment to ask for small human things, a record kept, a note left in the drawer, a list of people to be told. He asked that certain men be given leniency if they agreed to confess. He wanted to trade legal advantage for truth, to make his repentance useful. It was a complicated sort of morality, atonement offered as a transaction. The transfusions did what they could. The antibodies bound with the toxin, and for a time the monitor sighed as if relieved. But human bodies are not mathematical equations. They are messy, biological arguments with no guarantees. Theo's systems began to fail in ways the lab couldn't predict. The complexity of the toxin's interaction with his own blood, something the hospital staff called an idiosyncratic response, meant that his body was paying the price for becoming an instrument of rescue. His heart rhythm grew erratic. The very thing that had saved Cynthia's life was now devouring him slowly. It was the cruelest irony. The man who had spent a life controlling fate through men and money had finally used his body as an instrument of love, and the body failed under the strain. Cynthia knew then, with a cold clarity that did not soften with the movement of monitors, that Theo would not survive this. The knowledge came like a bell, an unavoidable fact that rearranged the room. When people say goodbye in movies, they have time for tidy sentences and melodic confessions. Real goodbyes are jagged and awkward. They are measured in small gestures, a hand squeezed, a recorded voice left to fiddle with, a promise to look after the child. Cynthia sat at Theo's bedside and watched the life she had been forced into dissolve into something that felt more honest than any public declaration he'd ever made. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, voice dry with the attempt to keep control. "I know," he answered. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers and handed it to her. "The safe code is the date of my father's death," he whispered. "You won't need it now, but you'll need the documents. The tapes are in the third drawer." She put the phone aside and leaned over him, feeling the fragility of the man she had been taught to fear and then to depend on. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and something else, old cedar perhaps, or memory. He touched her face like asking permission. "Don't let them make me the story," he said, and the words were a plea for nuance. Do not let his worst be the only thing the world remembers. "I won't," she promised. Theo's breath thinned. He found the energy to lift his hand and trace a line along Cynthia's wrist, a small map of a past that had been violent and saving all at once. "I would have done anything for you," he murmured, not grandly, but with a tired, aching fidelity. "I thought I knew how to buy safety, but I learned to try something worse, to give it." Cynthia felt a tear break free, and she did not bother to hide it. She reached for his hand and held it like one holds the only warm thing in a cold room. "You loved me," she said, and the sentence held every complexity: anger, gratitude, sorrow, and the slow unspooling of feelings she could not yet name. He let out a small breath and smiled, the expression thin and strange on his face. "Beyond life," he whispered, the words scratched out of him like a final signature. When he died, it was not cinematic. There was no last speech to a gathered crowd, no swell of music. It was a quiet loss in the small hours, the machine settling into a steady, final cadence. Cynthia was there. Asher stood like a statue in the doorway. A doctor closed her eyes and told her they had done everything. The world after Theo's death rearranged itself with a pragmatic clatter. Scarlet May performed her mourning with the diligent authenticity of someone aware of optics. Mr. Newman, in a statement released to the press, lamented his son's passing while simultaneously reasserting the family's position. Some in the city expressed relief that a dangerous man was gone. Others, shocked that someone with that reputation had a last act of tenderness.
But the headlines had to be fed. Cynthia read them like shards and then set them aside. She had her lists, the trust documents, and the safe. She also had, tucked in the back of a drawer, a recorded voice. The recordings were not confessions of abuse absolved. They were explanations of choices, admissions of sins, and an attempt to be honest in a way his public persona rarely was. He had left detailed notes for the lawyers, directions to free certain people, to provide funds to rebuild damaged lives, to call out those who had orchestrated attacks. In them, he admitted to the family's sins of power and named names. He left maps to hidden accounts and instructions to bring evidence to investigators. It was a final sort of penance arranged like a legal blueprint, fallible and human, but tangible. Cynthia turned those documents over to the people she trusted. She did not do it out of revenge. She did it because she wanted her child to grow into a world where a mother's name was not a bargaining chip, and where legal structures protected an infant from the sin of legacies. The wheels began to turn slowly. Investigations reopened, arrests were made. Ivy's charges compounded with new evidence. Scarlet May found her social scaffolding unmoored as donors distanced themselves. Mr. Newman fought tooth and nail to preserve his reputation, but his influence had been tempered by the revelation of internal crimes. The city watched in a mixture of outrage and satisfaction. It was not the hero's justice, but it was justice with teeth. Mateo, who had used love as a way to hurt himself and others, disappeared for a time, and then resurfaced with a willingness to testify. He had been reckless enough to think himself invincible, brave enough to feel remorse when the tide turned. He worked to make amends as much as a man shaped by desperate choices could. Asher, who had been Theo's instrument for so long, changed in the months that followed. The man's brutality receded from the center of his actions. He guarded Cynthia not with ownership, but with something like loyalty. He stayed, a protector whose own loyalty had been reshaped by loss into something quieter and starker. Cynthia grieved with the complexity of someone who had been both victim and beneficiary of Theo's decision. She hated him for the early violence, for the way his family had used her as a ledger.
She mourned him for the last acts that offered her a hard, unlikely gift. She felt guilt for the confusion in her heart, and anger at a system that forced choices into cruel boxes. She allowed the contradictions to exist because they were true. Months later, the city seemed to breathe differently around her. The Newman crest, once a looming emblem in her nights, had been altered publicly in accordance with the trust. A portion of the family's assets had been redirected into charitable funds geared toward women's safety and children's education.
It was not perfect justice, but it was a transformation that would, in time, change the playbook. Cynthia moved out of the great house. She did not flee the life that had been forced upon her. She reclaimed it on her own terms. With the trust in place and a network of lawyers and her small savings, she rented a modest apartment near the river. She painted the walls a color she liked and set up a nursery whose center was not a crest, but a hand-stitched mobile of river stones and silver charms. The wedding dress she found in the armoire was no longer an accusation to be burned. She took it down, unstitched a small scrap of lace, and sewed it into a cap for the child. Another piece became the lining for a tiny blanket. The ribbon that had once bound Theo's legal envelopes was tied into a bow and hung over the crib. It was not an attempt to sanctify a wrong. It was a way to make a complicated past into a gentle thing for the future. On the day the child was born, a small, fierce girl with lungs like protest, the hospital room was quiet in a way that felt like a benediction. Asher stood in the doorway, tearful and awkward. Mateo watched, distant and more humble. Cynthia held the child in her arms and thought of Theo as a man shaped by contradictions. She did not romanticize his cruelty. She honored the act that had bought them all a margin of safety. She named the child after the river, Marina. It felt right to give the baby a name that signified movement and survival. Life with an infant is bewitching and hard. Cynthia learned diapers and sleep deprivation, the small economies of coffee and lullabies. She discovered a tenderness that was not the shadow of forced ownership, but the bloom of a woman's volition. She learned to ask for help and to accept it. She took the child to the Riverwalk, where, on certain evenings, she would sit and hold Marina against her chest and imagine the hands that had once pulled her out of cold water. The memory of Theo persisted, threaded into the life in a way that did not demand worship or denial. Sometimes she listened to the recordings he had left and heard a man attempting to be honest. His voice was less the Reaper then, a brittle, flawed humanity that had finally chosen a sacrificial trajectory. He had loved her beyond life, she realized, not by romanticizing harm, but by making the ultimate act of giving, his own body and legal legacy for her child's future. There were public moments too, testimonies, hearings, statements that did not allow the past to be rewritten into comfortable narratives. Cynthia worked with prosecutors, not vindictively, but with the aim to make the city safer. She testified about the poisoning and the household dynamics, telling a story that was neither simple nor melodious, one that contained both harm and fidelity. Her voice, steady and measured, was a form of power that had nothing to do with money. Months turned into years. The Newman estate slowly reorganized. Mr.
Newman's authority dimmed. Scarlet May retreated to a life of smaller salons. Ivy languished in court, while Mateo found odd ways to make amends. Working at a community center, his anger reshaped into a flawed kind of service. Asher, still rigid and protective in some ways, learned to cook in a domestic way and made a mean pot roast for neighborhood barbecues. Life continued because it had to. 1 year after Theo died, Cynthia took Marina to the river. The wind folded around them. Marina's cap, stitched with lace from the wedding dress, caught the light like a tiny bell. Cynthia held a small silver charm in her hand, a scythe and a flowing river etched together, a miniature mark of the Newman crest that Theo had once made into an armor. She did not place it in the water for dramatic effect. She let it tuck into the soft wetness beside the bank, and then watched as the current accepted it, neither rejecting nor celebrating, merely carrying. "What was he to you?" Marina asked when she was older, mouthful of a forever child's curiosity. Cynthia would answer with care. "He was complicated. He hurt. He saved. He loved in ways that didn't always make sense. But he did one thing that changed our lives. He chose to put us first."
It was an imperfect answer, but it was honest. The story did not pretend pain and sacrifice were clean concepts. It did not ask for faith or forgiveness in exchange for a tidy narrative. It allowed the complexity to exist. Theo as transgressor and redeemer, Cynthia as survivor and maker of a new life, the child as the living consequence of choices both loving and violent. On the mantel, in the apartment that had once been only survival and now hummed with lullabies, there was a small wooden box. Inside it lay the recordings, the legal documents, and a single photograph. Theo by the river, looking older and kinder than the press photos had ever shown. Cynthia sometimes opened the box and listened to the scratch of a voice that had finally stopped hiding behind a crest. Sometimes she wept, sometimes she laughed. When she passed the house one day, the great Newman house with its cold crest and watched portraits, she felt nothing like the woman who had once been dragged into a lecture hall and forced into a ring. She felt more than a survivor. She felt like a woman who had made a life from the shards of an imposed fate, who had honored what was good in a man who had been both cruel and capable of sacrifice, and who had ensured that a child would not bear the weight of an ancestor's sins. The river kept moving, patient and indifferent. It had held both the scene of her near drowning and the small silver emblem she sent away like a letter. Underneath the bridge, children played with sticks that pretended to be swords, and with stones, tossing them into the current and watching them disappear. Sometimes Marina would throw a pebble and name each one after a person in a story. Names not of grudges, but of lessons.
Cynthia taught her to cook simple meals. She taught her that power was not about owning people, but protecting them. She taught her that apologies must be lived out through action, and that law could be shaped into a force for safety. Marina learned the names of people who had done harm, and those who had done good. She learned to ask questions and to demand truth. On certain nights, when the apartment was quiet and the city seemed to be sleeping, Cynthia would take out the small blue cap stitched with lace and hold it close. The world had been cruel, and yet she had found a way to thread mercy into its seams. Theo's last acts had been irrevocable. His life had ended in the act of saving hers, and the way he had loved, fraught, messy, sometimes monstrous, had culminated in a final, undeniable proof. He had chosen to make his life a balm for another. It did not erase the early seasons of his cruelty. It did not absolve him of accountability. But it did provide a legacy that Cynthia used to build something else entirely, a life in which her daughter could grow beyond the reach of a crest and a name. That, she decided, was the truest way to honor the man who had loved her beyond life. Not to sanctify his faults, but to ensure his final gift bore fruit. She liked, on the anniversary of his death, to walk with Marina down to the river and tell her the small facts that belonged to the story without cheapening them, about a man who had once been a reaper in the press, but who had chosen to be, finally, something like a guard. They would throw one small pebble into the water together, and the ripple would go out and vanish as all actions do. Then they would go home and make soup, and fold laundry, and live the quiet evidence of choices made, both terrible and redemptive. If anyone asked Cynthia whether she forgave Theo, she would consider the question and answer plainly. Forgiveness is a long road, she would say. It doesn't erase harm. It simply allows me to keep living. That, she believed, was what love beyond life had bought them. Not an absolution, but a margin in which to be human. If this story reached you and moved you, consider subscribing for more stories of complicated love, dark choices, and fragile redemption.